everyone. Welcome to this week's Workshop Wednesday. This week we're kind of taking a different tone with things, going from like talking about pooping in holes and hikes to talking about environmental justice, which is a bit like more like broad and deep of a topic. And I want to start by acknowledging that like both of us are white folks, and this is like we're not as impacted by a lot of these issues that we're going to talk about today as like some other communities and other populations. So we're going to talk about it, and we're going to like have a conversation about it and introduce you all to a few things. But we encourage you to like do your own research and kind of seek out other voices in this realm that can speak a little bit more to like what it's like to be experiencing like the challenges that we're going to address today. Oh, and my name is Christina. Sorry. and this is Corey, and yeah, we'll be the ones presenting.
Hi everyone.
Today.
My name is Corey, and yeah, just to echo what Christina said, you know, these are issues that we're just learning about, and hopefully we can connect you all with some resources to do some learning on your own as well. So what we're going to cover today is some definitions of environmental justice, talk about what's going on out there in terms of like some policy issues and actions folks are taking, discuss what it means to be privileged in the outdoors, as well as like mental health benefits that one can experience from being in the outdoors. And then we'll wrap things up by talking about some ways that you can get involved. And then we'll talk about what's hopefully going to happen in the future with all of this information.
So like Corey said, we're going to start by kind of defining environmental justice, because for some folks that's like not something people have heard of before. We like hear about climate change, and this is a little different. So the idea is that like as climate change happens, it's like there's a number of folks that are like maybe impacted in larger ways by like the like warming temperatures and things like that. And it's often people who have like fewer resources, or who are minorities in spaces, or who have been like oppressed in other ways as well. So like many folks have like the resources and connections to like move to different parts of the country or the world as forest fires like increase and flooding increases. But folks without those financial resources or connections are unable to do so, and are then like stuck in harsh conditions. It also can include conversations about like houselessness, like building pipelines, the clothing industry, food industry, city planning and infrastructure, access to parks and community gardens, and like just the resources and time that it takes to get out and enjoy the outdoors.
So this slide is some information that I paraphrased from a website that is actually linked further on in the presentation. But I think it's just important to recognize that environmental justice, so like equity in environmental justice would mean that like people are basically poisoned equally, or it's more distributed amongst people. So actual like environmental justice is about abolishing poisoning of folks because of like our modern society and the byproducts of that. So, you know, things like landfills and like rising heat in urban areas are impacting people of lower socioeconomic status, and more marginalized groups are really taking the brunt of those issues. And then in terms of Indigenous folks, I mean, really environmental justice in that realm, it seems, would be reacquisition of the lands that were stolen from them. And short of that, it means honoring what has been written into the Constitution for Indigenous folks to function unimpeded upon those lands, when in reality that's not happening. And land that has been provided or sequestered, I guess, you know, I'm sorry, I'm a little nervous about talking about this. It's pretty weighty, but basically what's happening is that, you know, we have pushed Indigenous people onto specific lands, and then we continue to take those lands from them even now. And so the justice in that realm would be to just give back the land, but that is not happening.
And so like one final kind of definition we have is that like environmental justice is the idea that climate change most adversely affects our nation's most vulnerable populations, the same people who are left out of our economic and political structure. So people who are vulnerable and like don't have a say in how things are run. And it's embedded in social justice and public health, and it's intertwined with land use and transportation. So now that you all have kind of like gotten this big overview of what environmental justice is, we're going to talk a little bit about like what is kind of happening in terms of that, and like who's involved and who's impacted by like these changes that are happening with our planet. So a couple like studies are listed on the side here. Like one thing to note is that African Americans most live in some of the most polluted areas of the country, yet produce much less pollution than the general population. 3 in 4 people in the world in poverty rely on agriculture and natural resources to survive. And the studies have shown that nearly like 33% of the world's like cultivable land has been lost due to pollution and erosion. So due to that land loss, there's a lot of people that are like having a much harder time surviving off of like agriculture.
Something that's going on locally here in Portland for the last few years has been the I-5 project that is meant to expand the highway through the Rose Quarter. And that goes through the Albina neighborhood, which is a historically Black neighborhood. And it's already been impacted by the highway system. In fact, much of the highway system throughout our nation goes through Black neighborhoods, and also other like minority neighborhoods. People with less resources are like really significantly impacted by the highway system. And so that's a project that the Rose Quarter project is going on right now, that they actually put it on a big pause because some local groups have pushed for a more in-depth evaluation of the environmental impact of this project, because the claim is that what has been proposed of what the potential impact would be is much less than like the reality of like what that impact would be. And also just like to throw out a money number, it's like a $700,000 or more project that's being spent, and it kind of has this vibe that the most important thing is to like expand the highway, when really what some local groups are doing, which is great, is putting this on pause and making us look more in depth about how these communities are going to be impacted. So that's one local issue.
Another more like national issue, as I imagine a lot of folks have heard about, like the Dakota Access Pipeline was like big and in the news, and that like that kind of stuff continues to be happening. For example, right now there's a bunch of pushback against like expanding a pipeline in northern Minnesota that would go through the Boundary Waters, which is like the super natural space that like with lots of lakes, no motorized vehicles allowed, and a lot of like Native American folks live in these lands up here. This is kind of like a multifaceted issue in that like obviously it's like using more oil, which like contributes to climate change, but there's also the fact that often these pipelines will leak and get into like natural water sources. No matter how much they try to say that it's not going to happen, it usually ends up happening. And when that happens, it's like often impacting like Native American communities and other like minorities and spaces that because they often go through areas that like wealthier people don't live in.
Another big issue locally, specific to here in the Northwest, is that we've put several dams through the Columbia River, which they were initially built to do their best to like mind the salmon migration. And then there have been like some improvements on that. Like over the years, they've really worked to make sure that the fish moving through the Columbia are as literally as at least impacted as they can be. But that still has like significantly reduced the amount of salmon that can get up into the streams that they have come from. And so indigenous populations have been really impacted by the dams. And I don't have it in front of me, but there are local groups that work with environmental agencies to continue to try and restore those habitats. And I think we have a link later on to an article that discusses that in a little more detail.
Yeah, and just some other, like another big noteworthy topic is like the houselessness situation in Portland. I think this one is especially interesting. Like there's been a lot of talk about like allowing or like utilizing parks as spaces to like build encampments for folks that are houseless to kind of help with that situation here. And there's like a lot of pushback about that because people don't want to lose their green space. And this one feels like particularly tricky to me because yeah, I think like parks are often like the only green space some people have if they don't have like access to like a car or other transportation to get out of the city. So using that for those folks would be like keeping that from being an accessible space for people. And it seems ideal to like maybe just use like some open land or parking lot or like construction space that like would be used to develop housing or like fancy apartments or something like that for these folks. But I think from a city end, like the city's not making money on the parks and so and like not making taxes on that. So it like they probably see that as most cost effective. And again, I don't know like what the right solution is. I think another thing that's worth noting is like there's a lot of pushback around houselessness from like folks that are care about like environmental justice and sustainability because of the impact that it like people living off of the land in urban areas has on like the watershed in the spaces. And like a lot of folks often have to go out and like clean up trash and like feces and things like that. And it's tricky as well because I think we're like unwilling to like set up trash bins or like more porta potties or things like that. That is like something that's kind of starting in Portland to kind of prevent that waste from like getting into our water system. But we won't, because it like acknowledges that it's like okay for people to do that. It's kind of like comes with the idea of like harm reduction. Like we can't necessarily get rid of this situation, at least right now. Like so a way to reduce the impact would be to like provide like bathrooms and trash services. But in doing so, it kind of some people see that as like enabling those things or saying that it's okay. So that I think is like just an interesting conversation around that. And how those folks are impacted by these things. Well, do you have anything else you want to say about any of those things, Corey?
I would
anything
say
else to
that
add?
I really think that, it's just so interesting to think about how, folks around Portland are consistently expressing their, dislike for large camps, for that people who don't have houses are setting up these large camps. And then there's all this, vocalization about how we want these camps cleaned up and we want to push these people out. And then folks have to go somewhere, I just think it's really interesting how much money we're like worried about spending on, bathrooms and trash cans and cleanup and like pushing people out. And it's like, if we could find ways to support folks instead of like villainizing them, of like thinking of like this conversation, I feel like so often revolves around like, oh, well, houseless people are like creating all this trash and they're like making these, large camps and like no one knows what's going on in there. And they want to take almost like this like aggressive stance against these folks. And it seems like a great opportunity to exercise more compassion, I think, and to like appropriate funds to like support folks to maybe like learn, maybe some skills about maybe folks, when you're so concerned about like where your next meal is coming from, I can understand that it's not as big a concern of like what kind of debris is like piling up and like blowing around, from those camps. And so I just think that like if we could have more compassion and like move into these zones and like provide people with resources to go to the bathroom and have like, more effective like sanitation, I think that because you pose the opposite argument of like enabling, and it just seems like there's a big middle ground between like enabling and whatever the other side of the argument is. And I just think that it would be great if we could move in the direction of compassion in that area, and instead of like being so worried about like, oh, what's cost effective, and like, oh, we're like spending this money over here. It's like, these folks are people as well. It's like, these are our citizens in Portland, like regardless of what official status people hold or whatever. So I get a little fired up about it.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. And I think the other piece to that I think is interesting is like, I think it poses a challenge for Portland to like provide more resources, because like most often in other states, folks that are like without housing are able to like get a one-way ticket somewhere, like in hopes that maybe they go like live with family or something like that. But if they hear that like Portland is like offering all this space, then like it will like increase the population of folks that we have in the city that are houseless. But it also like, so I think what needs to happen is we need to have like a standardized like national approach to this, because like just trying something radical in one city isn't going to be as effective unless we're like prepared to deal with like the entire nation's population. Because so I think that like it's just a like really complex issue. And like I admire what Portland is doing in terms of like not banning camping and decriminalizing drugs. And I'm like really excited to see like what happens with that kind of stuff and how that impacts that community. I think I hear some concerns from other folks of like that will just increase the population we have here. So yeah, I guess basically it seems like we need to like be prepared to deal with everybody and like take that approach, or like get something happening on a national level. Hopefully it's the latter, because I think that would be more effective in the long run. Yeah,
if we came up with something that was that other cities could replicate, that would be great.
Yeah, totally.
Something else I wanted to add too before we move on to action items. There was another article that I just read that was talking about so the World Health Organization was quoted in like 2014, I think, or 2016, about how like 55% of the world's population lives in urban areas. And that's meant to increase to like 70% like 20 years down the line, which seems quite staggering considering the impact urban environments can like have on folks. And like, so like city planning, I think, is really important, and like, kind of bringing it back to like accessible green spaces. I think it's really important, I think, moving forward to like advocate in any way that we can in developing urban spaces to have more green spaces in them, because rising heat from global warming is going to be compounded by concrete and asphalt. So those were just some numbers I wanted to throw out just to kind of put it in people's minds, like how important of an issue it is. Like city planning, might be like, oh yeah, people plan cities and whatever, that's someone's job, but like really it's something that we can all be involved in, because there are like town hall meetings and things, and which is kind of like what we're moving into next. So
cool, thanks. So yeah, this slide for this section is kind of like talking about some things that are happening more specifically in like the Portland, Oregon area, in order to get involved if this is something that has piqued your interest.
So the state of Oregon actually created an environmental justice task force, and that's clearly a link there if you want to click on that and check it out. But basically their mission is to advise the governor directly, and they also are working with natural resource agencies, and they hold meetings. I think typically they're in person, but now they're like Zoom meetings. And when you follow their page, when you like follow the link to their page, just on the right side there, it'll tell you when the next meeting is. And then somewhere on there, they provide a link to the Zoom. But basically it's really cool because, anyone can join and concerns can be voiced. And then they have a direct line, to the governor, to these natural resource agencies. So that's a really great way to amplify voices of communities who have been marginalized and who have been heavily impacted by these issues.
Yeah, and kind of in addition to that, we know a couple other organizations here. I might actually X out of this and show you guys some of their websites. But yeah, they're just cool organizations in Portland that you could get involved in. Oops, okay, if you are interested in doing so. So hold on a second. So one organization is Grow Portland. This is an organization that kind of does a lot of like education around gardening and like operates community gardens and kind of empowers folks to like grow their own food as a way to like provide more green space. There's also like a lot of studies that have shown the benefits of like just having your hands in dirt. So this is a cool way to kind of address that. There's also Opal, which is organizing people and activating leaders. They kind of talk about one thing they're working on right now, it seems like, is getting folks to like, they speak to the fact that like PPS is the only school district that provides like bus passes for students, yet a lot of the school districts a little bit outside of Portland that have like a higher need for kids to like be on, or like most of the areas in PPS are like predominantly white. So that there's like a disparity in that, and the fact that folks outside of like that district aren't getting bus passes and like easier access to transportation. So there's like a couple bills happening right now around that that they speak to, and then they just talk a little bit about like what they fight for as an organization, is doing like frontline leadership, gender justice, accessible spaces, climate justice, transportation justice, racial justice, and housing justice, and they see all these things as interconnected, kind of as we've talked about. Yeah, I think that's all I've got from those. And 350 PDX is another organization that does a lot of that. There seem to be a lot like working with youth, which I think is really cool. So yeah. So now we're going to get into like access to outdoor spaces. As like the outdoor program, we're all about like outdoor recreation, and wanted to speak a little bit to the disparities that exist in terms of like the benefits of that and who gets to benefit from those benefits. So a couple studies we cited here, like the smell of trees can increase your natural killer immune cell count, and it like sustains for up to 30 days beyond like the time that you spend in the outdoor spaces. So those are helpful in like kind of like fighting off diseases and things like that. Another study conducted in some pharmacies in London found that in the areas where there was like more green space, there were fewer like mood disorder medications that were prescribed to folks than in the neighborhoods that had less green space. In addition to that stuff, it's like known to lower inflammation, improve vision in children, concentration, inspires creativity, boosts immune system, improves short-term memory, and stimulates feelings of interconnectedness and belonging. So lots of good reasons to get outside. And this kind of just talks a little bit more about some different things some mentioned before, and there's some like references to where these studies come from. There's so there's all those things that are great, and the idea is that like there's not a lot of people that have access to those benefits, because some barriers, like just like a different, like a culture of that not being a norm to like go spend time outside, or not having the time to like go take your family on a hike, or not having a vehicle to get out of the city in, or even just like income and what it costs to like get a backpack and get the right hiking shoes and things like that. There's a study conducted in Denver that took into the quantity and quality of park spaces in neighborhoods, and found that both race and income were negatively correlated with like the quality and quantity of parks. So even within neighborhoods, there's some disparities. Another factor to consider is that like even if certain neighborhoods have the same amount of park spaces, sometimes they're like seen as less safe and like less accessible for kids to like go play at, because of like crime that might be happening in those communities. Corey, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I just think this would be an appropriate time to give a shout out to the Portland State Outdoor Program, because we provide free gear for students who want to go on trips. And I just think that that is a really great way to kind of like level that playing field a little bit. Obviously, like being a student at a university is it is a different barrier, but at least like folks that are there have that ability to go outside, and I think that that's just a really great thing that we do.
Yeah, totally. I'll you.
Sorry, I was muted.
No, that's okay.
Okay, so this organization, Wild Diversity, is really cool. And another barrier, kind of like aside from like physically being able to like get out and to like be outside and like just like cultural norms and things like that, is that from what I gather and what I've read, is that folks don't necessarily feel as safe or as welcome in green spaces. And like outdoor recreation is like largely seen as like a white space. And so Wild Diversity is set up to specifically teach and encourage and welcome LGBTQ plus and BIPOC folks and everyone really to the outdoors. They do some really great like skill workshops. Like right on their website, they have a link to like what is a packing list for like a day hike or a backpacking trip. And so I think that is a really cool organization that is based here in Portland.
Also on mute. Some other organizations here in Portland that kind of do some work around this stuff. One is Big City Mountaineers. They partnered it with different youth agencies to take like teens on week-long backpacking trips. They take volunteers. It's usually like 5 kids, like a trip leader, the youth agency leader, and then 3 like volunteer mentors on the trip. So that's a cool way to like get outside and connect with some awesome teenagers. Very Wild Portland does a lot of like free primitive skill workshops. So things like basket weaving or carving or yeah, a lot of different things like that. They're often like in the parks in the Portland area. So if you look them up, you can check them out. They do some neat things. Bark before COVID was doing like free informational hikes. I went on a lichen hike with them, and there's somebody who taught us all about a bunch of different kinds of lichens, and we got little hand lenses. And the cool thing about this was we like met at grocery outlet, and like people could carpool. So if you could make it to grocery outlet in Hollywood, you could like then be able to ride with other folks to get out to Mount Hood area. They're also doing like a lot of advocating for protecting Mount Hood spaces. Like at the end of the hike, they'll have you like write a letter to kind of advocate to like stop logging in some of those areas. Seattle has a gear library for folks to check out gear. And they provide like public transit to trailheads throughout the summer, which I think is a really cool thing. Grow Portland, I talked about a little bit. They do some work with like community gardens, and then Pear has an outdoor recreation program for youth that are and young adults that are without housing. So these are some great organizations to like get involved in the Portland area if you're interested in connecting with that. So as we said, like a thing you could do is volunteering with these organizations, getting involved in like figuring out what policy and stuff is like getting up for vote, like getting passed, and doing like advocacy around that, paying attention to that, and like finding out what other people want and like what they'd prefer, and like help supporting and advocating for that as well. I think a key thing here is like we might think we know what is going to be best for people, but unless you're the one in that situation, you don't. So just trying to like check in about that. Yeah, Corey, if you want to add anything else?
I think, I mean, I'm just going to parrot you a little bit here, and it's listed like twice on the slide, but I think, this is something that I'm learning as I'm like, just kind of, I feel like a lot of interest in these issues, and I really care, and I really want to just like jump in and like get it done. But I think that like something I'm learning that is so important is to like take a step back, and like you're saying, it's like I might be really stoked to like enact a solution, but the reality is like I need to learn more about like what folks who are like really experiencing the brunt of these issues are seeking, and then to support that. And I think that I just want to encourage everyone to like jump into one of those task force meetings, environmental justice task force meetings, like see what's going on here locally. If you live somewhere else, you know, I'm sure there's something similar, you know. These are all just like a Google search away. Environmental justice and the name of your city, for sure there's something that's going to come up. And then I think that, you know, I've just really been getting into like following those trails, and like that's like how that's how I found like the Wild Diversity organization. Was just like, I wonder if there are folks who are like doing this, you know. And boom, there they are. And then you can support them always by like even just like donating like a couple of bucks or like whatever if you don't have time, because like time obviously is a super valuable resource, and it's wonderful to give that. Yeah, anyway, I just wanted to say that like taking time to learn what people see as like solutions for themselves is like really important.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. So, and to kind of wrap this up, there was a post on my Instagram that I found that had some like really kind of thought-provoking questions around this work. So I'd invite you to just like take a minute to read through some of these. Some that stood out to me was like, do I value human rights over or animal rights over human rights? Like veganism is often like tokenized as this great thing to do. But like how much good does that do if like we're kind of not paying attention to like the other inhumane practices that are happening like with our fellow species? And then like I also like the one of like, is my activism rooted in shaming people who aren't doing enough versus like uplifting the folks who are doing what they can? But yeah, there's just some like really good thought-provoking questions here to kind of like check in with yourself on and kind of keep yourself in check to like make sure that we're centering this movement around the folks who are most impacted by it. And it was posted by Shop Thoughtful on Instagram.
Yeah, I think ideally like at least one of these questions, you know, will challenge you and like kind of get under your skin a little bit. I think that's like the point. So like
Yeah.
You know, that self-reflection is not always easy to do, and there's just so much to learn. So I just, yeah, I want to encourage folks to like, you know, challenge your own perspective. Like even if you're someone that is like fully behind social justice, environmental justice, and you're like learning, you know, just don't forget that there's always another perspective out there, and there's always another way to like approach an issue and to think about it. And yeah, just to constantly be like open-minded about everything, really.
And that being said, like we're open to feedback if folks want to reach out to us and like have like, yeah, any like critiques or like feedback for like how we've done this presentation. Like I'd love to learn more and hear from folks around this topic.
Yeah, same, definitely. I would love some feedback. I think y'all can probably tell throughout this presentation I've been a little nervous. But again, yeah, you know, we're just learning, and we're happy to like share all of like what we have discovered with you all. And we would love, you know, the reciprocity of like sharing back with us. Would be great.
Yeah, we've even, I mean, if folks are interested, we talked about started like having some kind of podcast, bringing folks in to like talk about these things, because we want to acknowledge that like, yeah, we're maybe not the voices to be like speaking about this the most. So kind of to wrap up, I listed a big long list of a bunch of Instagram influencers that are doing like really awesome work around promoting like sustainability and environmental justice stuff. Most folks are like queer, people of color. I'm part of the LGBTQ community. So I'd check these guys out. They like have a lot of really great content. And then we've got a page of like articles and books and podcasts you can listen to. These are again kind of like just to start. You can definitely figure out this stuff on your own through Google search, but yeah, feel free to check this stuff out. Hopefully there'll be a PDF of our slides like in the comments or description, and you can go in there and check these things out later. And here are some more sources. Yeah, anything else you want to add, Corey, before we wrap things up for today?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good. Well, yeah, thanks all for watching and diving into this topic a little bit with us. yeah, we hope you learned something from it and some parts of it like piqued your interest, and that you continue to learn more beyond that. Hope you all have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.